What I'd like to do now is shift to a panel discussion. Naki, to get the ball rolling, in Kjell's presentation, there was a specific mention of IASA research in the IPCC context. Now, of course, you've got IASA background there, and I believe you did a lot of the underlying research there. So I'm going to give you, if you like, a right of reply, and perhaps if you could just take us through your understanding of the peak oil issue and how you came up with some of the projections that you outlined there. Because in this session, I'd like to get a real sense of, peak discovery, peak oil, where are we on that, and what the slope decline might be like, because that's the underlying issue here.
Well, the issue of the peak oil I would like to address later on when I make my comments. Let me just now clarify the situation with the IPCC scenarios that, as Professor Aleklett said, they're now 10 years old, so that is an advantage of hindsight. Those scenarios were designed in order to reflect the range of assumptions in the peer-reviewed literature. That's important to know, including the highest and lowest emissions and how they come about. And the scenarios covered about 90% of the literature, and Professor Aleklett said that the lower ones are consistent with the idea of that oil might be peaking. The higher ones would be also consistent with conventional oil peaking, but not necessarily with the unconventional. But there is an important point I would like to make. And that is that if we look backwards, the bad news is that the actual emissions have tracked the high scenarios rather than the low scenarios. And this is one of the reasons why we need, I think, real transformational change, what I would like to address in my comments.
Great. But do you have your slides now? Can you take us through those?
Can I do that? Yeah.
Yes, please do.
It'll take only about 8 minutes.
I think that's important that we get that cleared up.
Can somebody start the presentation, please? I only have a couple of slides, but I would like to address that question. And while the transparencies go up, let me just also thank Georg and Michael for the kind invitation to be here and congratulate ASPO on the 10-year anniversary. That's really an important event. But since Dennis Meadows is sitting next to me, I have to mention another important event. It's 40 years of Limits to Growth. And I think that was really a paradigm-changing study. It certainly influenced me, but I would say the whole generation of people, especially when Dennis came to IASA and organized the global modeling project. I think that was a real insight. So we have 40 years of experience in thinking about the future. Now we are living in the Anthropocene. That means that humanity is influencing planetary processes. So I think one has to look at the oil in this broader context. And I want to just argue that we need this kind of paradigm-changing transformation. And I would call it the need for efficiency and decarbonization revolution. And let me just show you that, rather than to focus on whether the oil will be peaking tomorrow or in a few years. The real important, I think the real important opportunity is 2012. The General Assembly has declared the year Sustainable Energy for All. And I expect that in 20 days in Rio, there will be traction on energy. Energy is a very important entry point. And the Secretary General has declared 3, I would say, very ambitious aspirational goals that are consistent with what we are talking at this conference. Number 1 is universal access for the 3 billion people excluded. We didn't mention that now. That's really important. Almost half of the humanity doesn't have access to oil. Then we need to double the efficiency, otherwise nothing will work, and efficiency improvement rates. And the suggestion is to double the contribution of renewables. So I think these 3 goals, and I would like to show you, are consistent with the topic of this conference. And I would call it phase out of oil rather than peak, to distinguish the physical from what might be happening from the socioeconomic and environmental needs. Let me just highlight to you what the problematic looks like. This is the new work of the IPCC 2007, in contrast to the work that I chaired that was shown by Professor Aleklett 10 years ago. This looks now, what do we need to do to stabilize climate at 2 degrees? If you look at the historical emissions, they've been increasing at about 2% per year. And the green curve for the future implies what we would need to do in order to stabilize at 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial. The peak would have to be essentially now, in 10 years or so, and by the middle of the century, the emissions would have to increase at least 50%, decrease at least, maybe even 80%. The later we do that, the more negative emissions might be required later, and that's really complicated because biomass with CCS might be the only option to do that I'm at least aware of, in addition to the afforestation. Now, let me just show you another thing, and then I'll conclude. This is the history of energy. We are 80% fossil. That shouldn't be forgotten. 80% fossil, and we have very little time to turn this around. I would like to show you a scenario that fulfills the three conditions of the Secretary General and the 2 degrees in the long run. That's how it could look. Why? It's not the only one. The really important characteristic is we need to improve the efficiency by at least 40% over the next 20 years. And that's a lot of lifestyle changes. It's not only technological fix. Here, we would also have 30% renewables. Nuclear would be phased out. I think in the aftermath of Fukushima, this is ever more important to understand those futures. And please note that oil is being phased out also over the next 10 years. There is another possibility with nuclear, for example, but the conclusion about the oil is essentially the same, except we would need also CCS here because the fossils have a higher role. So let me just conclude by, this is a scenario that shows 100% renewables. That would be certainly expensive, but it's technically feasible. So those kind of futures exist as well. We have looked at that in the German government's Council on Global Change. And let me just conclude with one thing that I think, if you have not seen these numbers before, might be of interest. This is the content of the atmosphere of carbon before the Industrial Revolution started. 2,000 billion tons of CO2, 2,000 gigatons. This is how much we have emitted during the Industrial Revolution, the same amount of carbon that was in the atmosphere when we started. It's dazzling. So that has increased the atmospheric concentrations by 1,000 gigatons, and that's almost 400 ppm today. This is what we can still emit. This is our CO2 endowment, if you wish. We can only emit about 750 billion if you want to be consistent with the 2 degrees. Now, this is oil. Reserves from the literature. There is a range from 600 to about, I think, 1,500. I think Professor Aleklett will probably agree with those numbers. Here is the gas, a little bit less. But together, please note that together it's about 1,500 gigatons. So conventional oil and gas reserves is twice as much as we are allowed to emit if we want to stay on 2 degrees. This is really important. I think this is one of the major drivers, while the fossils would have to be phased out, and if they're not phased out, then we will have to do carbon capture and storage, another problematic technology. And then to conclude, here are the tar sands, huge amount of carbon and unconventional gas. As Jeremy Gilbert said, nobody really knows. The upper bound is huge on what the resources might be. So if the shales, even a small portion is extracted, that would be an issue. About coal, I don't need to speak. You know that it's large amount of carbon. So walking away from fossils, I think it's very similar to the Neolithic revolution, where we also didn't use all of the stones. We discovered something better, which is agriculture. I hope we will discover something better now, which is a sustainability revolution.
Naki, let me come back to you just for the question there about the 105 million barrels a day that the IEA says that we'll need by 2030. And specifically, leaving aside the climate arguments and the sociology arguments and the economic arguments, do you think we could achieve that even with the best assumptions on improvements in energy efficiency and price that Jeremy highlighted? Yeah,
I agree with what Jeremy said, basically. I think it's really a question of economics, technology. I mean, there are three factors: environment, technology, economics, and the most important fourth one that we should also talk about is the civil society. I mean, what we think about our common future. And, you know, any bigger accident might also influence how we will see the future. But technology will no doubt progress. If we have high prices of oil, we will probably be able to bring on board more unconventionals, meaning more environmental pressure. That's why we do scenarios, because there are a number of outcomes. But I was just arguing that I think the broader need for a broader societal transformation might mean that we would be in the lower rather than in the higher bound.
Great, thanks. Dennis, of course, you've been in this space for, as Naki said, over 40 years. And not limited to fossil fuels, looking at resource thresholds and so forth. The Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Sustainable Development recently highlighted the fact, and I think, Kjell, you highlighted this as well, that we're not only looking at a fossil fuel limit and climatic limits, we're looking at a world that's going to need 50% more food by 2030, 40-odd% more energy, and that low-carbon energy, and 30-odd% more fresh water. Looking at your experience just over the last 40 years, and particularly what you're hearing here today, would you like to just share with us your learnings of how we might see this peak oil challenge?
So I will reflect with a slightly different context. It's not ASPO, 10 years lessons learned. It's limits to growth, 40 years lessons learned. In 1972, we published a book which had a table of data in it that showed there would be supply constraints, not only in oil, but in many crucial resources. Interesting enough, the data weren't ours. They came from the U.S. government. They were from the U.S. Geological Survey. Our contribution was to put them into a model which, combined with theories about economic growth, population growth, and so forth, traced out the future consequences. And so with the few minutes I have this morning, I would like to reflect on what I see to be the future consequences. I don't know personally a lot about oil. My insights about this come from my participation in the ASPO meetings, as well as a careful perusal of the recent report from the Energy Watch Group, which German think tank, which concluded that by 2030, oil production would be roughly half of current levels. It's interesting to us because our models, which we built back in '72, all projected that the end of growth would come in this period between 2010 and 2040, not only from oil, but from other forces. So what would we expect? What do I expect? I've identified 4 knots, 4 things I think won't happen. But they're crucial because in many cases, even here at ASPO, we assume they're going to happen. I don't think we'll see $200 a barrel oil in real prices because oil at that price collapses economic demand sufficiently that we can't afford to pay the price. So I suspect we're going to be now in a period which we've seen where oil ratchets up, it shuts off economic activity, demand collapses, comes back down. When the price goes down, the drilling stops. People start, as we are doing now in the United States, building new fossil fuel demand capital, like natural gas, electricity plants. And so we're now in a period of oscillation. But although the nominal price is probably going to get over 200 because of all of the inflationary efforts which are underway, I don't think real prices will see it. The second thing we won't see is a gradual accommodation. A very interesting, provocative book recently published about oil traced out the parts of the demand which would gradually drop out as oil prices go up. It isn't going to happen like that. If you build a carefully designed race car to go 200 miles an hour and then you take off one of its tires, it doesn't go 150 miles an hour. It just doesn't go at all. And we have built a carefully contrived system based on the assumption of uninterrupted supplies of oil. And the oil supplies are going to be now interrupted, and it will cause chaotic disruptions, which we're beginning to see. We won't see general acceptance of these ideas, unfortunately. I remember I went to the ASPO meeting in Washington, D.C. last September. One of the sessions was organized to be held in the Congress so that it would be convenient for congressional staff people to come over and learn about peak oil. Not one showed up. We went to all that trouble and nobody came. Energy is so pervasive that when it starts to be a problem, people will complain about inflation or stagnation or environmental damage. The euro crisis, in my mind, is absolutely has a very strong fundamental connection with high oil prices. And it will be like we see now in the United States with climate. The more obvious become the data for the idea of climate change, the more adamant become some corporate and many political leaders denying that it ever is going to happen at all. There's two ways to link data and conclusions. In one, you look at the important data and decide what conclusions they warrant. In the other, you decide what your conclusion is and then look around for data that will justify it. And unfortunately, ASPO is going to be feeding its information into a group of people who already know the answer. And then the fourth knot, which is specifically for ASPO, I don't think ASPO is going to be an important player in the debate over the next 10 or 20 years. And I'm very unhappy about that, but let me tell you why. I saw the Club of Rome evolve from being a first-rate important organization in 1970 to being a totally nondescript and irrelevant entity today. The Club of Rome used to hold its meetings in Vienna. This year's meeting will be in Bucharest. Why? Well, in the 70s, the Club of Rome said, disaster is coming, disaster is coming. And of course, everyone said, no, that's absolutely not true. You're really crazy, you're stupid, you're whatever. In the 80s, in the 90s, when they said disaster is coming, people started to say, you're right. What should we do about it? They didn't know. They didn't have any capacity for finding out. They didn't even have a predilection for finding out. And so they're still down there in Bucharest telling everybody that the disaster is coming. ASPO has been telling people that peak oil is coming. And initially they said, you're crazy. But now they're starting to understand that there is peak oil, and they want to know what to do about it. And if you look at the program, it's not telling you. This is a program about peak oil is coming. That's a knot which I hope we can untie. I hope it is possible to shift the organization over into a useful, incisive analysis of what we need to do about it. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. And indeed on your analysis and research point, I think on your analysis and research point, that's another gap. Not only do we have a short on some information, we need actually to deal with that information better and access additional information. Now, on that point, just two questions to the group, and then I want to get some questions from participants. Jeremy, you particularly highlighted this issue of that there's information there, and in the case of unconventional, perhaps there's information that we need to get that isn't quite there yet. Dennis's comment, the politics of this, how are we going to get that information? What's the advice of the group on how best ASPO can actually access, link together, and target research better around the missing bits and pieces to graft onto the work that Kjell and others have been doing?
Well, I mean,
is it possible?
I think Dennis's pessimism about ASPO is probably correct. It doesn't really matter whether it's ASPO or not, but somebody outside the oil industry needs to address this problem. We need an analysis which is not driven by commercial considerations. We need the United Nations, we need the World Bank, we need someone to step in and say, look, this is a huge problem. It needs to be addressed by somebody outside the industry. The industry must make data available. Whether it's ASPO does the analysis or whether it's somebody else, I don't know. But independent analysis needs to be done.
Yeah, Kjell?
Yeah, then when I started to work in this, with these problems, I was lucky enough to be a professor at the university, and I could concentrate on doing research at the university. And I think that that connection has been very important. And as I mentioned, we have now 30 peer-reviewed papers dealing with these things. So I think that the university and networks among people at the university might be a strong way to get forward, because we know how to do science, so to speak, and we should use an organization that already exists, and the university exists. So I think that we will continue to work on these things now at Uppsala, and as the university now officially are saying, yes, this is great, this is something that Uppsala University should do. We hope that we could be some kind of center for doing these things, and other universities around the world can come together with us.
Yeah. Naki, you would have a comment on that?
I think this is really an essential point, and I think if one wants to take a really a cynical point of view, then one can say that the more the world becomes digitalized, the less information we have. And because I think one of the primary reasons for that is that the public authorities are giving ever less funding and ever less effort for collecting the data and collecting it in an independent way. So it is true that industry will have the data, but that's all private. It's all needs to be appropriated. It's outside of the peer review domain. We need new mechanisms of bringing this information in the peer review, because there will be a difference of views. So it not only needs to be independent, I think it has to be scientifically reviewed, and this should be one of the biggest. I think one of the biggest challenges, and it doesn't concern just oil or the energy supply. I think it's even more critical on the energy demand and energy end use. You mentioned cars and so on in the presentation. What people are actually doing, we need to document much more than we have in order to understand how this transformation might come around. And let me just, if I may, take a few seconds to react to what Dennis said that I think was essential, so it doesn't go. You addressed the issue of the volatility of oil, both the price and the production. I think this is one of our biggest problems right now, that we have huge volatility in the system, so that most of the agents and actors are hedging rather than thinking about the long-term future and what positions need to be made to achieve certain visionary goals.
Yeah. It seems to me that we've had a number of countries that has had their military and intelligence units looking at peak oil, and that's never really made the light of day. Is it possible that the prominence and role of corporations worldwide now, which is, I think, seeing a historic shift, where there's a greater demand, particularly from financial markets, for companies to be more transparent and audited on their activities, do you think that that's a possible way that actually might be used to get more data, but noting that in those cases we've only had more data come when there's been a disaster that's affected people more generally? Dennis, do you have a hope there that we might be able to use political forces more effectively?
It's not just a matter of getting the data, it's also a matter of getting the techniques which allow us to understand the data. Mm-hmm. And if you take a large oil company, an Exxon, a Shell, a BP, you're probably looking at something like, off the top of my head, a couple of hundred engineers in each of those companies who are assessing the data, their own data. Mm. So it's not just a case of getting the data, it's also a case of getting a large number of people to analyze this data. And these people are in short supply. The industry finds they're in short supply. So even if you can set up some kind of independent agency to acquire this data, there's going to be a big problem in acquiring the people to assess the data.
Not if financial markets become involved. A number of people wrote to the Bank of England recently saying that peak oil and carbon risk was essential to the economy. Mervyn King responded that there was an issue that was going to look into. If financial markets take an interest in this being the real risk to companies, let's face it, that 5 out of 10 of the most profitable companies of the world, 5 out of 10 of the most diverse companies in the world in terms of their oil and gas production are all driving this demand.
I accept completely that it would be sensible for banks, for financial institutions to start trying to understand the oil industry. But they don't have the people. This is not just a matter of finding some guy who last year was analyzing the cornflake industry and putting him on the oil industry. This is a very, very complex. Yeah. Reservoirs are very, very complex things. You're looking at the movement of oil, gas, water molecules through tiny pores. They don't behave like cornflakes or cigarettes.
So we have a capacity issue.
Specialized business.
A human capacity issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dennis.
I think it's useful to get better data, but actually, I think we have good enough data now to start thinking about the next 10 years, because the uncertainties for me, the crucial uncertainties, are in what we're going to do about it. We know that oil is going to decline. If we had better data, we might be able to refine those estimates slightly. But the key point for me is, what will be the response of the transport sector? What will be the politicians' response to continued economic stagnation and so forth? Historically, disruptive technologies have not come from the established industries. They come from the peripheral. And so we're talking about enormous disruption. I don't think we're going to find the information we need about it at the core. You mentioned the World Bank as a possible research group. I'm informed that it's actually essentially impossible to talk about peak oil inside the World Bank. The notion of peak oil is so disruptive and so damaging to their long-term plans and to their current programs that they have two choices. They can change everything, or they can deny peak oil. And of course, it's much easier to simply deny peak oil. The really intelligent people I've talked to who are well informed on the matter tend to be professors or retired people. I have a dear friend who's recently retired out of one of the National Geological Surveys. Extremely well informed about peak oil. He couldn't talk about it or explore its consequences when he was working for the government, but now that he's retired, he's able to be a wonderful source of information about it. So you wouldn't pick him up, you know, in any effort that you go to free up the transparency of these institutions. So maybe, maybe ASPO could become an interesting center for the people who've retired and are now able to really start talking about these things.
Thank you. Okay, if we've got a couple of microphones ready to circulate in the audience, a couple of quick questions. I'd ask people to state their name, the question, and particularly to whom it's addressed, and limit their intervention to 1 minute, please. Have the two people there and then somebody over there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
May I just make a short comment on what Dennis Meadows said by quoting Blaise Pascal, who said in the 17th century, musing about human nature, we run unconcernedly into the abyss after we have put something in front of us that prevents us from seeing it. 300 years old. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And then we have two over here. Gentleman in the blue shirt and then one in the fifth row. Could you stand up, please?
Yes, sure. Good morning. Christian Kirchner from CERI Vienna. I'm particularly grateful for what Professor Meadows just said before. I think one of the big problems, and I'm doing a PhD in looking at peak oil, one of the big problems of why people don't want to listen about it is because it is so negative and people don't want to lose hope. Peak oil needs to be presented as an opportunity, and that's actually what it is. And this is why we need to look at real solutions and real ideas. So one of those ideas, radical ideas, I would like to ask the panel what they think of it. It has been mentioned already by Jeremy, which I'm particularly grateful for, is what are we going to do in order to limit the resources so that we can adapt appropriately and we don't collapse. And the Rimini protocol is an excellent example for it. But there are other examples like the Yasuni ITT initiative in Ecuador. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's basically about caps and capping the oil that we have in order to have a smoother transition. So, yeah, the question is, what does the panel think of it? And why is ASPO not driving, for example, the Rimini protocol more ahead? Thank you.
Quick response on that one.
Well, what you call the Rimini protocol is something that Colin Campbell and I wrote together in 2003 in Uppsala. And the thing is that the fact that you're saying that something should decline, and the economists are saying that we need to have an increase in things, and I think that is the big problem. We must find ways to get say, the growth in get the money turned around, so we can buy things in the future. That is the most important thing. And I used to say that we must find ways to help each other in a way that don't cost so much energy. And sometimes I say that culture should be 100% more effective and should be more important for people, because that will make creation of growth in the economy without maybe take so much energy. So new ways to think about buying things and not buy products produced with energy is very important for the future.
Jeremy, did you want to comment on Rimini?
Well, I mean, for something like the Rimini Protocol to be adopted by a large number of countries would, I guess, imply that the politicians, the people of those countries, had both accepted the concept of peak oil and were broad-minded enough, altruistic enough to see a decline in their living standards. I think we're a long, long way from that point. So I think these are dreams. I think the changes that are going to happen in our energy usage are going to be forced on us. We're not going to volunteer for them because we're humans.
Great.
Yes, my name is Yves Cochet from France. Dennis Meadows told us that ASPO is not a powerful organization. Don't you think, as a president, Mr. Aleklett, that ASPO should link with or be with the IPCC, because IPCC is rather influent in the world, and there is no climate change on one side and peak on the other side. There's only one problem. It's an energy problem. Energy, upstream or downstream, fossil or in the atmosphere. It is the only and the one problem. So why don't you try to be included in the IPCC, saying we are specialists of peak oil and fossil fuel, and you need us because you don't know anything about it. See, your scenario is not good, so together we'll be more powerful.
Yeah. I must say that in 2003 we were showing that the emission scenarios that was used at that time could never happen in reality. And when doing this, I was very surprised that we were not invited by the IPCC people to come and discuss this. And I must say that I've been considered to be an enemy against IPCC because I'm saying that these scenarios is not possible. The thing is that because of using these scenarios with this very high emission probability, it has been possible for the industry to say, we believe in business as usual. We believe that it is possible to increase our use of energy because that is what the IPCC is saying is possible to do according to these scenarios, But if we had the fact that people should understand that these scenarios is not possible, then they will change. I will take an example. One of the big industry leaders in Sweden, I was presenting for the board peak oil, and he believed in it. And he said, well, I don't, he was in the oil industry. He said, I see that I should not invest in that sector any longer. I should invest in something new. So he invested in the biggest wind farm in Sweden ever built, was because of the fact that he understood peak oil. And it was not because of the climate. So I don't mind at all. But I mean, if I'm not welcomed to IPCC, what should I do?
Well, IPCC doesn't really invite people to be involved. I think the authors need to be nominated by governments and international and other organizations. And I think it's a great pity that ASPO has not participated in that effort through the local authorities and others. Now the fifth assessment report is, so to say, in the middle. It's already too late for it, but perhaps at the level of the reviewers, ASPO could make a contribution. I think it's really just a matter of being involved. It's not I don't believe that there is a big conspiracy. We have, in any case, we are completing now the global energy assessment that will be published in Rio, will be released in Rio, and in that effort we really try to include people from the ASPO network.
Great. And in this afternoon's session on the geopolitical, we're going to look at the international energy institutional structure, and we'll raise that in that context. Gentleman here in the blue shirt, third row.
Simon Ratcliffe from the UK's Department for International Development. It's a question for Jeremy Gilbert. Earlier you spoke about the fact that ASPO had, to some extent, achieved an acceptance of the peak oil concept or notion. I think probably you're right, but I think what people haven't done is thought through what the implications are. And that's probably something that ought to be spelt out or gone into in greater depth. And I think there are probably 5 or 6 areas, the implications for transport of goods and people, and of course trade. There are implications for food and food production. There are implications for economies and the financial system. There are implications for conflict and social cohesion, and probably technology and innovation. But we need to kind of spell that out. So perhaps some comments on that.
I can only agree with you. Paul told me I could only speak for 20 minutes this morning, so I really didn't get a chance to go into any detail in what I said, but I agree totally. I think our message has gone out. I don't think that it's been acted upon by politicians. Day-to-day crises tend to take priority. We all know that certainly Western Europe is going through a financial crisis. People aren't going to sit down and think long and hard about the energy crisis until they've sorted out I think they've sorted out the economic one. So yes, the message has gone out, but we've got to keep on sending it out, reinforce it until people actually react, and the reaction hasn't yet happened.
I can just mention that things are starting to happen now. I was just recently invited to a conference in Quebec that is there's an organization for all the parliaments in the world that has a yearly meeting, and this organization has been going on for 127 years. So they have their 127th meeting in Quebec, and they have put up peak oil as one of the discussion things for all the delegates from all the parliaments in the world, and I think that is very, very good to see this.
Thank you. Microphone to the front row here, please. I recognise that there are lots of people who'd like to ask questions, but I'll let this run over 5 minutes over the meeting time, so that'll give us another 10 minutes, so if everyone could exercise discipline within that.
Well, I was one of the founder. I was in Uppsala of this ASPO group, and I have a rather positive view of what has been achieved during the last 10 years. I think the world is aware of the problem globally. It was not before. So I don't think the past has been a failure. Now for the future, obviously the idea suggested by Dennis Meadows would make sense in theory. Let's look, what should we do? And in fact, ASPO France, we have decided a year ago to go in that direction. And it looks extremely difficult. Because, in fact, when you want to look at the decarbonizing of the world in the future, you immediately fall on the problem of renewable and nuclear. It should not be an opposite question, but that's the way it is. And this ASPO organization shows it very, very clearly. In Cork, we tried to initiate a debate where the nuclear had only 2 little sessions. It was a disaster. This time, there was not even one session could be organized around nuclear. So if you refuse to speak, analyze, understand an energy which is still 5 times bigger in terms of energy produced, electricity produced, than the renewable outside of the large hydro, obviously we will fail. If we already are completely biased in our mind, there is no way we can have any meaningful participation in this future understanding of the energy problem.
Thank you. And we'll take that as a statement, I think. Ewan.
Okay.
And then over here.
Ewan Mearns from the University of Aberdeen and the Oil Drum. I've got a rather complex series of connected questions for each of the presenters. Is it Nebojsa, your name? Said that you have as a goal to double energy efficiency. Now, I certainly agree with that. I would be surprised if anyone in the audience doesn't agree with that, and I think it's probably achievable. Now, Dennis said he didn't think we were going to be able to afford $200 oil, but I'm sure if we double energy efficiency over a series of adaptive phases, we would be able to afford $200 oil in real terms. Now, Jeremy told us if we can afford $200 oil, we're going to go out and find a whole lot more oil, and that's certainly true as well.
Find it, recover it.
And recover it, find and recover it. So looping back to Nebojsa is why is one of your objectives through energy efficiency to enable the world fossil fuel industry to ramp up production dramatically? And the final comment for Kjell is that he rightly said is that if you want to control emissions, that's a supply-side strategy that has to be put in place. And so the question for Kjell is, what is the probability of the US government shutting down the US coal industry?
Well, of course, we should discuss what we need to do in the future. And as I mentioned before, I'm lucky because I'm at the university, so I can speak with young people and tell my students, this is a possibility for you in the future to get jobs because they are in the energy business and they are the heroes for the future, you know. But we have problems. When talking about efficiency, there is something called thermodynamics and the thermodynamic efficiency, and so it's not just to say that we should double the efficiency because some of that doubling is not physically possible to do, you know. And that's another thing that we must learn, that we are in a stage now that physics plays so much more. It's much more important compared to with economy, you know. And I can explain why that is the case also, but I have no time for it. Yes, it's a very challenging time, but I think that when the people that is governing the money get the reality clear and they look into what should we invest into the future, no one will invest in a new oil refinery, for instance, because they cannot fill it with oil. And the other thing is that they will do that and that. And another thing is, it's also important for us to understand that the car must be there in the future. No question about it. Because we are so many people depending on moving around with cars, so we cannot have a future without it. So that means that we have to change how we fuel the car in the future. And I used to say that electricity is the most democratic energy source we have in the world, because there are more people in the world that have access to electricity every day than to have access to gasoline or diesel or anything. So it must be through electricity. And yes, I say that the new car that here in Europe, for instance, Opel is presenting, the Ampera, is the future. So we have the future. We should just get the future moving, and I think we should all help to get into this move.
Certainly that's the point that the New Scientist makes this month, that it's electric-powered cars that's going to make the biggest gains, although in terms of market access, since their launch, they haven't made a great deal of progress. Did you want to come back on quickly?
Can I? Yeah. Very quickly.
And then two last questions over here.
I think the point is to double the efficiency of intensity of energy use, whether it's per euro or per passenger kilometer. So Ampera is an excellent example. But I just wanted to make a broader point that was not discussed so far. It's very, very short. Most of the solutions that we have to the current dilemma are capital intensive and have very low cost in the long run. And that's not consistent with the volatility you're talking about, nor is it consistent of making high rates of return within few years. So the business model has to change. It's not just a question of will. It has to go beyond. It's a broader change than just tweaking here or there. That's why I called it transformation.
Okay, two quick comments here and then a last round from the panel.
Fritz Binder-Kriegelstein, Renewable Energies Consulting, Mödling, Austria. The first comment is, yes, Dennis, as we know, the retired people would be the one who could bring forward data more efficiently for the to figure out the solutions for the future, because they are independent, nothing else. The second is, as my experience as a lobbyist for the transition of energy for some years is only economic issues would drive the change efficiently. So if the oil price goes up, the renewables, energy efficiency and all other possibilities grow and prosper. Nothing else does. So if we want to change, and ASPO is one of the important players on that field, they should change their efforts to PR, which are in the main aspects are economically driven. So the issues have to be economically, because this is the only language the people in the fossil and nuclear sector do understand, and the people out there understand on their bills. Thank you.
Thanks for that statement. Yes, last comment there.
Thank you. Karin Kneis, I'll be a panelist this afternoon. My question goes to Mr. Gilbert regarding access to data. In 2005, the United Nations launched a joint data initiative, JODI. What is your experience about having access to that kind of data, and how transparent is it? Thank you.
I was aware at the time of that data. I must say I don't know what's happened to it since. Maybe the questioner could remind me of the scope of the data. My recollection is that it was a fairly narrow scope, and I don't think that anybody has mined that data. Maybe somebody will correct me. Kjell?
Well, I think that in principle it only has helped the International Energy Agency to get access to some more data. But as said before, the absolutely accuracy of data is not so important, because you can you don't need to pin it down to the year. You just you can see with flexibility of data you can pin it down to a couple of years, you know. And for changing an action, that should be enough. I mean.
I don't agree with you. I think that the big problem that we have when we're talking about supply, and I know everyone's been talking about demand and the effect in the atmosphere and everything else, all I know about is supply. The big unknown in supply is the price that people are prepared to pay for it. If we're prepared to pay $60 a barrel, the supply will be very, very different to what it is if we're prepared to pay $160 a barrel. And for us outside the industry to understand what that difference will be, we do need data. We need accurate data, and we need we need the technology to actually analyze it. So don't forget that connection.
But I mean, it might be that we can only need very accurate data in a region, for instance, say the North Sea, and see what this price fluctuation can do there. But again, we are into detail now, so...
Yeah, we'll get that. Quick one, Naki.
I would agree that we don't need the data to know that business as usual will not work. But I think when you zoom into the detail, we must have data. I mentioned before, 3 billion people have no access to energy. We know almost nothing about what their future energy consumption would be. We need to work on that, because they cannot repeat our lifestyles. It has to be something new that still needs to be invented.
If I could leave this stage having conveyed only one idea, it would be that we shouldn't overemphasize the role of price. It was interesting to watch Russia last summer when they had a shortfall in grain production. They didn't worry about price. They simply stopped exports and held it for personal use. More and more of the oil is being pulled out of the market and allocated for non-economic reasons. And so if we want to think about what's going to happen in the future, we don't need 3 decimal point accuracy on the supply or demand curve. We need to start thinking about the political tolerance for pain, the kinds of non-market mechanisms that will be available for allocation, and the nature of social tolerance for declining living standards and satisfaction. And those are not things you're going to get really precise data about. But they're the ones that are going to make the big difference.
Yeah. I used to say that look at the fact that we have the exporting and importing countries. And, of course, the exporting countries can decide we will not export any longer. And I used to say, who should export oil to Russia in the future? And the answer is no one. And when you have that answer, you can just start to think, what will the Russian leaders do in the future? If they find out that will they continue to export the volume they do now, they will not be exporting oil in 2030. They need to import oil. And these things are much, much more important to understand than any details in an oil field. And that's why I pointed to the fact that the world is divided into countries that are importing and exporting things. And the thing is that the exporting countries, unfortunately, are not so democratic as the importing countries. And that is the aspect that we have in the future. And I also like to say that it's probably the last time I say something of this section, that with this section, I officially now declare that my book is open for sale.
Okay. Well, listen, we're going to have to draw a line under it now. We do also want to take advantage of breaks to have informal networking discussions. I think it's fairly clear that we don't know a lot. The physics, we understand the limits of physics, and on the supply side, I think there are some real questions there that have been highlighted very well by Kjell and Jeremy. But as Dennis has highlighted also with Naki, the great unknown here are the markets, the sociological, the political responses, and how we deal with those. Join me in thanking our panelists and speakers, and we'll see you back here at 11:30.